But every policy has got to have a purpose, and it's got to have a context, and it's a context of time and circumstances at that particular moment in time. I was trying to give a flavour for what were the circumstances at that time. I'd come into government from 17 or 18 years as a councillor, where I'd served on an education committee all of that time. And I was at the education department on 2 occasions between 99 in the first parliament and when Donald Dewar died in 2001, I guess it would be, 2000 and then I was back again between 2003 and 2006. And I want to talk first of all about that first period, because there's a really positive side to that first period, and there's a really unhelpful negative side to it too. A lot of the negative side helps drive why we're trying to change things to make them better. On the less positive side, even though we had 2 years of a Labour government by that point, from 1997 to 1999, there was still within the system what people perceived to be a legacy of the Tory party approach to education policy. And a sort of sense of disinvestment in education on the one hand, and a lack of investment in policy and depending more on market forces to potentially drive improvement, something I personally reject. I guess the other thing of the time, partly because of that, was that teachers were really down. I mean, really down. And this drives an awful lot of what happened was how you addressed the professionalisation of teachers. Teachers felt done to and done down and undervalued in a very major way. Part of that, I have to say, as a Labour politician, was the rhetoric of politics between 97 and 99 in regard to education had not changed dramatically from the previous period, and it was a high focus on target setting, driving improvement through target setting, but also the language of failure. Failing schools was very much emerging as a kind of theme for how you tackled education policy. The other big negative factor was that the Millennium Commission pay negotiations collapsed just as we came into government. And do not underestimate the importance of that. I mean, that was a traumatic event. They collapsed with a huge vote of teachers against what had been sought to be negotiated. But there's people in this room who understand this more better than I do, but the teachers had come together voting for entirely different reasons as it happened. But anyway, defeated. And that was disastrous for the system at that time. And we were on the verge of a national strike. And that would have conditioned the whole future of education. And trust had been broken completely between the local authorities and the teachers, local authorities being the negotiating body. And to a significant extent too, trust had been broken between government and local government. We also happened at that point to have the meltdown of the SQA and the Section 28. I won't go into any of that, you could have separate days on that alone. On the positive side, the positive bit about the Labour victory in the next Senate election, and then Labour being in government in '99 with the Lib Dems in Scotland, was that Tony Blair came to office with a mantra of education, education, education. And I pretty much departed from that point in a lot of policy detail, but that meant resources were coming in the way of education in a pretty colossal fashion. So we knew we were going to have a lot of money to play with. I use that in its proper sense. What else happened was positive. Samuel Braith, who sadly died in the last 2 or 3 weeks, in his inimitable style, abolished the Scottish Joint Negotiating Committee for Teachers literally overnight. It was one of his kind of extraordinary but decisive things, and that was a precursor to him also setting up the Macron inquiry, and that reported during that period. The rhetoric, we purposefully chose to change the rhetoric of how we talked about education and talk positively about teachers and how they were the key to the success of the system, not the problem in the system. That was very deliberately done. Other positive things, nursery education was rolled out and was funded and became universal and statutory. I visited Finland, and I'll just leave that hanging because I'll refer to that later. We introduced standards in Scotland Schools Act 2000, and that did a whole range of things. But in a policy context, it was quite deliberately crafted to move away from hard target setting around exam results, driving progress to a much broader concept of continuous improvement at a school level. A variety of factors, not just exam results. And we changed the purpose of education in that Act, and I don't think that has ever really got the recognition that it should have got, and I don't think a lot of people necessarily understand this, but it's what also helped drive the curriculum change that comes later. Remember, at that point, education statutorily had this exciting purpose, which was you were to provide as a local authority adequate and efficient education, end of story. And that doesn't really inspire an awful lot of people. I don't think. That was a system. And the important thing about that is it was a system focus. It was adequate and efficient education. That was the focus on the statutory purpose of that kind of education. And that Act in 2000 started to change that by bringing in a child focus. I was writing down the words a bit earlier today. Education in the Act says, education shall be directed to the development of personality, talents, and the mental and physical abilities of the child to their fullest potential. And that's a key bit of that. And that was a signal of moving from a system-based approach to a child-focused approach and much more personalisation of learning. And within that, the due regard had to be paid to the child's views. And again, that was about choice beginning to be talked about in broader policy terms. I don't think people necessarily understand that was lying in part in that Act. There's other features in that are also quite interesting. Anyway, why did we do that? Well, it's partly to address some of these problems that we were also aware of in the system. The attainment gap in Scotland between the more advantaged and the more disadvantaged was chronic. It remains chronic, frankly. It's not yet closed nearly far enough. But there was a huge tail of underachievement. And that had profound consequences for the economy as well as for individuals and their personal lives. We knew that the PISA scores, the international PISA table, Scotland was levelling off, others were improving. Discipline in schools was a real high topic of the day. It was plaguing the entire system, and that was partly a symptom of the disaffection of teachers within the system. Teacher morale, as I said, continued to be low. That was a huge problem. Head teachers were increasingly frustrated. They were feeling constrained and limited in what they could do, and yet these are people of enormous ability and capacity and weren't being given the freedoms to allow them to express that in a variety of ways. And there was just a huge, I used to call it casualty rate in the first 3 years of secondary school. Kids arriving, boys in particular, well motivated generally when leaving primary 7, and within 3 years couldn't wait to get out the door. And actually the system couldn't wait to help them out the door too, in truth, because it was quite troublesome a lot of them. So that was why the Standards of Scotland Schools Act was there, partly to start at the beginning of the process to drive that. Now there's then a changing regard when Donald Dewar died. Jack McConnell became Education Minister. Literally I remember having a chat with Jean Freeman, who's sitting back here, on the day Jack arrived in office, when he kind of said, I handed over the keys home. And I think it's the following day at the start of the negotiations on the Macron settlement, Box of Common settlement. And there'd been a lot of pre-work on that, the relationships were so bad that there had been a lot of work done in advance. Anyway, Jack inherited that, and within a year had got the deal. And that was fundamental in getting basis for turning around the atmosphere in the system and beginning to build again some trust between the profession and the wider system. And so that was absolutely critical in all of that. Jack also tried to deal with the discipline problem. There's a discipline task force at Edinburgh, right? There's a report, the name of which I cannot remember, but trying to change the terms of the debate about all of that and trying to get that off the agenda. The induction programme came out of the Macron system discussions. The Chartered Teachers stuff came out of that. Continuing professional development deals came out of that. And they were all important in terms of changing the atmosphere in the profession, trying to change the atmosphere in the professional status of teachers as part of that. And the other thing that we were just touching on this was we sat down that few people actually knew about it, or I suppose still don't know enough about it. The Assessment for Learning programme was kicking off, and that was sanctioned in that time. And that was really one of the most important things in my view that was happening underneath the system. Not visible terribly, but it was changing. I mean, I remember meeting a friend of mine teacher who'd just been on one of the IFL courses, and it had kind of transformed her life totally. She was thinking of the world in a different way. Anyway, so that was happening. That's all I'm going to say of Chapel. There's much more, but the time is short. Another changing of regard, because he was only there about 10, 11 months or something. That happens. When you see, I used to find this when I did speak at early education conferences. You could see a totally disinterested confidence because they knew there'll be another one along in a week or two, so why bother honestly? That was the sense you had. And that was charming in the system. Anyway, another changing regard, Cathy Jameson arrived as the Education Minister. But arriving at a time where pay had been taken off the agenda, the Macron deal had sorted a lot of that, and the first settlement was a 2-year deal, I think, as part of Macron. The first time, probably ever, in living in the acting, we had a 2-year pay deal. And I'm going to come back to the importance of that, because that's a critical factor in change and how you manage change. Anyway, that gave Cathy a climate in which she could do things you couldn't otherwise necessarily do if pay was always on the agenda. And then the national debate was kicked off. And that of itself was a colossal event. I mean, I was away somewhere else, I was at finance at that time, so I'm not up in the detail, but Philip will have much more in the detail of that. But even just looking back on it and thinking about it and the basis that it created for what you could then do, hugely significant event. Highly participated. Nothing like this had ever been tried before. Something like 20,000 people took part in that debate about the future of Scottish education. But most importantly, what came out of it was essentially people were saying, well, we're pretty satisfied with our education system. We're not looking for a market approach to education. We parents don't want to run the schools. We want our head teachers to run them. Yeah, we want to say and all that kind of stuff, but we don't want to run them. And we think comprehensive education is right. Now, that was settled at that point. And that was great. But it was also saying we're concerned about testing and assessment processes and the pressure on kids in the system. And we're not sure the curriculum works for the 21st century. So that was coming out. And accountants need to look at the 21st, to look at the curriculum at that kind of point. I then came back into office in 2003, and I remember vividly being sat down and briefed and thinking, well, not a lot's moved on since I was here before, because the problems were exactly as I'd left them, with the exception of these clearly big things that had changed in the environment around that. But I also came back, and I've been at Finance and Public Services, and I was exposed to a whole range of other considerations. And if you remember, at that, sometime at that point, Wendy Alexander was at Enterprise, and the whole thought of higher skilled economy, smart, successful Scotland, is that what it's called? All that stuff was very up in my mind for a variety of reasons I came into contact with at that time. The other thing that was very clear was the continuing globalisation of the economy and what that meant for our young people and how they could compete in the world, but who's going to be competing with them in the future. Also, what was much more apparent was the human waste that we could no longer have if we wanted to be a smart, successful economy. Not only was it important to help people get out of their difficult circumstances for personal, human reasons, but it was important economically to get more productive people. And that meant education was central to national economic success, and that became absolutely clear at that time in government. Teachers were still, surprisingly, were still very down. We had not, despite the Macron, despite the 2-year pay settlement, we had not recovered the ground on that by any means at that point. Teachers were also telling me they felt this was a new dimension I got, because previously it was only about pay and disaffection and all of that. The other thing I was getting was they felt hidebound by 5 to 14 curriculum guidance. Too much guidance, too much prescription, too much testing. I've got no room to practice my craft as a teacher because the systems tell me to do things. Real anxiety about that. I remember meeting one teacher who just said, for God's sake, stop shouting at us, just tell us what to do and we'll do it. I'll come back to that because that's the last condition you want teachers to be in. So that's where they were. And that meant that you could, because of the worries with the curriculum structure, you couldn't stop and pause with things that you thought your kids were interested in, that you could add value to. Just wasn't really the system for that. I was personally concerned, more and more concerned, I still remain concerned, with the dominance of the exam system on our entire system of education. It just drove everything. In what I thought drove us to narrow the curriculum to become coaches rather than teachers, and to coach people over the specific hurdle you had to clear within the next 5 or 10 months or whatever. And I guess we stopped educating kids quite a while ago, actually, and started coaching them. And that was a real concern to me, but also the system was too much waiting for the next instruction from central government to tell it what to do. And you can't run an education system on the basis of a government waiting to make up its mind about what to tell the system to do next. You had to find a different way of making the system work. Employers were telling me that kids were coming with qualifications but were pretty unemployable. That's an overstatement, but that's what they're kind of saying. Didn't have wider life skills or team skills, all that kind of stuff. Wider achievement in the system wasn't really recognised, it was only attainment that was recognised. And again, I found that personally quite difficult. I visited Finland again, and came back even more impressed than I'd been the first time with the freedom of the teachers and the professional status of teachers, and the whole concept of reflective professionals who challenged each other about their standards and about what they were teaching, and grew as a consequence of that. And also, just another, there's lots of other factors, but vocational learning, given respect and a place, and you didn't have to you did have to make a choice sometimes about that, in a much better place. So that's the background, and then we set up the curriculum review group.
Right, thank you very much, Peter. That was a pretty comprehensive overview. I think maybe I'll let Philip in.
A quick comment on the commentary on all that. Clearly, Peter's memory is better than mine. It does seem like quite a long time ago that we're thinking about all this stuff. So I came into the picture towards the end of Cathy's tenure, just before Peter came back as Cabinet Secretary for Education. And I think so I'd missed the difficulty here. I was doing other things through the sort of difficult times around that preceded the Macron deal, the SQA collapse and so on. So I came in, I think, on a moment of a real sort of sense of renewal in the Scottish education system, a real sense of things were picking up and going in a very interesting direction. I have to say, in terms of Peter's recollection of all of that, the fact that we had the wherewithal to fund that was extremely important. But I do remember a time, I think probably towards the end of our respective tenures, when I said to Peter, what are we going to do next year? Because we'd looked at just about every aspect of Scottish education over those 4 or 5 years. So in addition to all the things that Peter's mentioned, don't forget we were rebuilding, literally, lots of schools at that time. It was a huge part of what we did. We had a big programme on additional support for learning. Remember that was kicked off in that time as well. We were doing stuff around free school meals. We had a review of initial teacher education, which I think is probably the one that we undercooked most. I'd have liked to have had my time again. I think we would have maybe replayed that slightly differently. We were undertaking the work that led to GLOW, and don't forget how innovative that felt at the time in terms of an education system building the technical wherewithal to talk to itself in a very open and very professional way, involving the learners and all the rest of it. And all the things that determine to succeed and enterprise education, and all the things that Peter has mentioned. We were looking at pretty much every dimension of the Scottish education system, and Bill, remember, I think at the time also looking at the way inspections were working, and so on. So LTS was really what it was doing, and the SQA, which had come out by then of the sort of the intensive care, but refashioning itself as an organisation that could do its job, but not just do its job, but do its job extremely well. So it was an actually brilliant time. I did 4 years as the director of Schools Group, and I do look back on that as probably one of the most sort of creative and productive times of policy maker that I've had in the entirety of my career. A lot of the things you do as a civil servant are far less entertaining, in a sense, far less fulfilling than what I felt that was at the time when I began. Just a couple of things to add to what Peter said. The mirror of what we were talking in terms of the discussion of the teaching profession, it's also worth reflecting on the relationship between government and local authorities. And I could maybe just illustrate that with a story. There was a regular meeting, I can't remember what it was called now, but where Mike Goethe, as the head of the education department, I and my colleagues met formally the directors of education in their formal sort of guise. I remember going to the first meeting of that, and the agenda was a yard long. And every item on it was one way or another about money. If you want us to do this, new community schools, if you want us to do this, we need money, we want to do this, we need money. And this is extraordinary. We're not talking about education here. We're just talking about the mechanics of using it all this. And it wasn't a hostile relationship, but it was not a productive relationship. And one of my challenges was to turn that round. And one of the huge advantages I have had, and folk who work in the Scottish Government still have over colleagues in the South, was actually the wherewithal to do that was right in your gift, because what you could do is you could get all those folk in a room together with the HMIE folk, people in SQ and LCS, and that's what we started to do. And in my time, I think we probably had 7 or 8 24-hour away things. Bill will remember them, Karen will remember, come to one or two as well, where we were trying to build that discourse amongst the people who were responsible for leading education in Scotland from the government side. And hopefully that had a lasting impact on that relationship. Maybe just one word in terms of then what then sort of segued into the curriculum for excellence process. Coming out of the national debate, and really to echo what Peter just said, there were 3 things that really, I think, grabbed us. One was this whole clutter thing. And it wasn't, it's obviously not, still isn't the statutory curriculum in Scotland, but all of this guidance that teachers just felt had completely jammed up what they were trying to do. The second thing was this thing about not recognising the practical consequence of that, the professionalism of the teachers themselves. And I think the third thing was an absolutely critical start-off point. This was just the sense of purpose. What was the purpose of the curriculum? And that, in a sense, then goes a launch pad, which led into the curriculum for excellence process.
Louise?
Okay, well, what I'm going to do, since that many of the issues that I was going to raise have already been addressed, what I'm going to focus on is the professional context. And that, of course, how were teachers feeling at the time? And teachers had come into a story of innovation, and they'd come in at various points in the system, but there had been a number of innovative programmes over a number of years. And they had one thing in common, which is that they'd all started off with very good intention. So, for example, Standing Gradient, which was about assessment for all, was about enhancing social justice in the system. 5 to 14 was about opening up the curriculum. It was about giving children a better chance of progress by bringing primary and secondary schools into closer alignment. And Higher Still, which was about bringing together the academic and the vocational divide. So all of these innovations had started off with really good intentions, but the good ideas had started to fall apart, and gaps had begun to emerge in each of them between what the original intention of the innovation was and what was actually happening in practice. So, for example, in standard grade, what had started off with teachers having a very central role in the development of curricula had moved to a position where, for a whole range of reasons related to workload, materials were being produced and teachers moved from being professionally engaged in curriculum development to being people who delivered programmes. So the role of the professional changed. In terms of Assessment 5 to 14 policy, there are some fascinating things in Assessment 5 to 14 policy. For example, if we take the Assessment 5 to 14 document, the Assessment 5 to 14 document explicitly stated that teachers' professional judgment should lie as the basis of the decision-making processes, and that national tests should be used to moderate teachers' professional judgment. So the role of the professional was absolutely key in policy. Of course, what happened in practice, because 5 to 14 emerged in the white heat of the accountability agenda, and so national testing moved from being a moderating device to replacing teachers' professional judgment. So there were high levels of accountability, and of course there was a whole national testing issue where the EIS, together with the parents, took a stand against government at the time and said, We don't want national testing to be used in which the way is planned within policy, and policy was changed in order to have national testing used in a gentler way. However, the other thing that was going on at the time was that teachers, I think, had been exposed to a whole series of models of change that had varying degrees of success. So, to caricature a bit, but there were a number of very popular models of change. One of them was the DTIP model, which was drown them in paper, which meant that there was an assumption that if you sent lots of documentation into schools, that would lead to change. There was another model, which is the TS&T model, tells some of them, which is commonly referred to as the cascade model, where some teachers were brought out of schools, they were given an experience, and then they were asked to go back into schools to share that with their colleagues. Schools are incredibly busy places, and so that kind of modelling isn't going to work if you're looking at large-scale change. Another one, which is a very dangerous one, is the ATIS model, which is assess them into submission, which is built on a premise that argues, if it moves, assess it, and if it doesn't move, assess it anyway, just in case it moves in the future. And what that leads to is massive amounts of bureaucracy, but actually very little impact on children's learning, which of course was the main issue. And the fourth one, and I think is the most dangerous one, which is NMTQMIN, which is never mind the quality, make it manageable. And that tends to happen in the innovation cycle when things are starting when the gaps are beginning to emerge. And then what happens is that original ideas become caught up in other issues commonly of workload, but rather than addressing the issue of workload, amendments are made to programs, which mean that the gaps between them begin to emerge between the aspiration and the reality. So when teachers are feeling dispirited, then I think the series of experiences that they'd had led them to stop trusting the system. And it was that lack of trust, I think, that led, in addition to the issues around finance, but to the feeling of being undervalued within the process. The other issue, from my perspective, is that professional context is a tidy phrase that we use. What was the professional context at the time? And but in fact, the reality of all of that is far more complex, because individual professionals are working in a very wide range of different circumstances, leading to professionals being in very different places. So there are people who are far more engaged in an innovation, and where they are in relation to progress will be a very different place from someone who's in very little contact with what's been going on. So we use these generic terms, but actually I think perhaps we need to begin to learn to live with complexity rather than using these terms, which I think have a negative impact on ideas of progression. However, when a new parliament came, the new feeling around the system, I think, has been very helpfully described by the previous two speakers. So let me take that as a given just now. There was a commitment to collaboration, and before Curriculum for Excellence, there had been a consultation on assessment, and that had identified a number of issues that had to be addressed. The first one related to finding new ways to engage people in professional learning. The second issue was about reconciling learning with the accountability agenda, which would seem to be very damaging to previous initiatives. And the third one was managing processes of bureaucracy. And in that context, and from that process, there was a ministerial action group established which brought together the key stakeholders from research and policy and practice to set up what became, as Peter described, the Assessment is for Learning programme. And that was interesting, I think, from a policy perspective, because it was designed from a different basis. It looked at research not only on the topic on assessment, but it also looked at research on transformational change processes. And so that programme was designed bringing together these two features. It was about the research and transformational change argued very strongly that what this kind of large-scale change was about was creating knowledge-creating systems, where you needed a shared statement of guiding principles. You also needed the infrastructure to support community building at policy levels, both local and national policy levels. There was an H in the Assessments for Learning programme. These groups were established. There was also a higher education group where researchers from every university in the country came together to build ideas, and there were school communities that developed right across the country in order to work together to take ideas and think collectively how these might be put into action. So rather than people being told what to do, it was a collective endeavour to try to address these issues. The purpose of it was to collect information that would inform future policy action or future action. And the changes in terms of the programme might lead to changes that were needed in practice, but it might also lead to changes that were needed in policy. And that was a very different shift, I think, in the rationale. And the last thing, but at the beginning of that process, before we move into thinking about curriculum for excellence, as curriculum for excellence began to emerge, Assessments for Learning was beginning in that process. And what was interesting was that working with the groups of teachers across the country, that when, as researchers and policymakers, we were trying to work with people to have them think about what ideas might mean in practice, they echoed the words that Peter used earlier, which was they said, look, we know that you actually have the solution. So let's cut this nonsense about engaging us in the process, just tell us what to do. It will be easier on all of us in the long run. And so Assessments for Learning, before Curriculum for Excellence, was all about changing that culture, to think about how collectively people could come together to address issues of common concern. So that was the professional context for the beginning of Curriculum for Excellence.
Thanks very much, Louise. I'm quite keen that we move on to begin to talk about the mechanics and the nuts and bolts now, and particularly, I think, talk about the review group. What I'd maybe like to do is to maybe start that by playing a short clip from George McBride, who's a member of the review group, sort of telling us what it was like for him. If that's come up.
There is a point to be made here about the nature of a group like the Curriculum Review Group, of which there were, I checked it, 19 members. And it's fair to say that at the first meeting, when I walked in, I already had met in one situation another 14 of these members. And I think there is an issue about a representative group like that within a relatively small country where people already know each other, and the risks, and I'm not saying they existed in this case, but the risks of the cosy consensus of the all nod in one side and being on the table. Now, I don't think we did do that, but I was aware that that was always a potential risk. It was very interesting to be a member of that committee and observe the way in which it worked. A large part, if you like, of the stimulus and starting papers for particular sessions of the group were provided by civil service representatives. And it is fair to say that the skill with which they managed a group, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, the skill with which they managed a group and drew out of a group both key ideas, critiques, criticisms, new questions, was very significant. Sometimes we worked as a whole group, sat around the table discussing a paper. Sometimes we were given key questions to discuss in small groups, report on and thrash out. The management of it by the senior civil servants was, I thought, highly impressive, and I don't mean management there in a bad sense. The fault lines in terms of assessment, the fault lines in terms of personalisation and choice were, in my view, the two major areas of difference within the curricular review group. There were other minor areas of disagreement, but in general the group worked very well. And one of the interesting features of the way it worked as a group was if one member said something, then often another member would build on that. And there was one day in which two of us decided that we'd had enough of this positive atmosphere and decided to try and just be negative and build on people in a negative sense. We said, well, I disagree with that, and the right answer would be. and to try and pursue that. And we couldn't actually keep it up for more than 5 minutes before again we found the whole group working together to try and address whatever was the issue in front of us.
Okay. A warm endorsement of the civil service approach to this.
Well, I was a bit nervous before you started that, just what George might say. So, just to give you a sense, so this is now dropping down a little bit into the detail how we set this thing up, how we ran it. It is a long time ago, and I've not, since I left I've not been deeply involved in sort of educational stuff since then. So the sort of recollection of some of the technical side of this is a bit vague as far as I'm concerned. But I think the starting point for me, and particularly for those of your students who look at this as a policy exercise, it's worth remembering I am not an educationist, and my immediate previous job coming into the schools directorate was on secondment to Scottish and Newcastle. So I had the juxtaposition 1 week sipping May NSA Epané in France with leaders of the European alcohol industry, and the next week chairing a meeting of the SNCT, the Scottish Negotiation Committee for Teachers. So this was one of the sort of more, if you like, vivid juxtapositions in my career. So I went from beer to bands in a matter of weeks. So I came into this not as an educational expert. I came into it as a civil servant, as a policy maker. And I think, again, for those who look at how the civil service, how policy making works, thinking about people like me as a gearing mechanism between the people who do know about stuff and the political process. And it was my firm intention in all of this not to become the expert, because there were people in that room who knew far more than I would ever know about education. It was my job, in a sense, to draw that out and to channel it to a common purpose of achieving agreement around how it would shape the future curriculum. That came to the extent to which that people kept talking to me about mun and dunning, and I used to annoy them by getting it the wrong way around, talking about dun and munning, and I thought, well, this is a sort of a brand of biscuits or something. But everybody was sort of saying, have you read? And I thought, you made a decision, so I'm not going to read mun and dunning. I'm going to think about this as an exercise where we're trying to achieve a curriculum for the future. This is not about, if you like, me understanding that part in a deep sense. There were plenty of folk in the room who could do that. So the starting point for this, I think there were two things I'd just draw attention to. One is, as George has already said, this is quite a big group, but it was designed to be an inclusive group, so that there were representatives around that table of lots of different points of view from the education system. And that's not just about people who were from schools and teacher councils and industry and so on. It was people who would bring different personal perspectives into the room. It wasn't designed to be a group of people who would all get on immediately and agree with them. There was lots of points of tensions in the group, and that was part of the purposes of the starting point for this. I think the second thing to draw attention to is that we were determined from the word off to root this in values. This was quite tough. As we all know, when you start trying to design or define a set of values, that can take you off down many interesting byways, but difficult to draw it to a conclusion until some genius spotted the mess in the Scottish Parliament and the values inscribed on that. And thought, it's good enough for the Parliament, it's good enough for us. And that gave us a fixed point in terms of the values that underpinned the whole process. So my memory of this, and it may be slightly gilded memory, is I really had two objectives in trying to steer the work of this group. The first was that it should start at the end point. And let me explain that. As we set off, people were thinking about the curriculum as it currently was. So people's starting point was the problems with the current curriculum. And you started adding all those problems up, and you had too many things to deal with, and you couldn't, if you like, spatchcock all of that onto the structures as they were there, and actually have a coherent whole. So I very deliberately got people to start to think about where we wanted to go, what's the end points of this, and that took us fairly rapidly to the purposes of education, and hence the four purposes which were at the heart of all of this. My second, if you like, principle in all this was to try and produce a product that was comprehensible to ordinary mortals. As a veteran, even then, of civil service consultation papers and documents that ran to 60, 70 pages, you knew yourself that you never read them, so expecting the world out there to read and understand them. That seemed to me not to be the place we want to end up with this. So something that was very straightforward, very simple, and tried to capture what we were after in a way that was accessible to the world out there. And that's what drove it ultimately. I said, if we could do it on one page, I'd be happy. And we did, which was the four purposes of education set out, of the curriculum set out on the one page. And if nobody read anything other than that, then we had a good sense of what we were trying to do. Just in terms of the dynamics of it, George is quite right to remember the way that we structured, the way we met, sometimes in full session, breaking up little groups. But the other thing, again, this is more for your policy, people thinking about policy-making process. Too often with these things, you get people into a room, they travel a distance, they get their mind into it, you meet for an hour or 2 hours, then they go away again, and you lose the momentum of the rhythm. So one of the things we got to meet for half a day, full days, we had away days and all the rest of it, so you could build up both a bit of an esprit de corps across that group of people, but you also had time to think, have the debates and have the arguments. And I remember it, and this is again maybe a slightly gilded memory, I remember it as a very good human process, I remember it as a very productive process, and one in which people very quickly were prepared to say, well, I've got a view here, I know that others might not agree with it, but let me put it on the table, it's a constructive, forward-looking, and ultimately productive process. Now, just one final sort of anecdote from all this. When I kicked this off, my children were in the early stages of their education in the Scottish system. My objective was that my younger boy would be among the first of the cohorts to actually experience the curriculum for excellence. He did his standard grades 3 years, so he was the last cohort, I think, to come through all of this. But one of the things, in terms of feedback from the folk in the room who've lived and breathed this since then, what I'd love to hear is whether the principles that informed the work that we did have stood the test of time in terms of the place that Scottish education is now at.
Okay. Peter, do you want to add?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I remember Philip coming into my room and saying, well, that's it. Got a deal on the report. And obviously, I mean, I don't know how much you understand or know about what was on in that process. That had been meeting for about a year, I think, at that point, and there are all sorts of conversations going on between the job that Philip was doing and the minister concerned, and some of them are fairly formal, signing off paperwork and so on. I hated paperwork, so most of it was done by conversation. In fact, Philip and I developed a splendid system that we could get all our paperwork down to about 3 sides of A4 every week to one paragraph and things, and I was able to sign it off if I was happy or ask for more if I wasn't. That's by the way. I couldn't have been more pleased to receive that document. It was just like manna from heaven for me, because not only was it simple at its core, it was deep also. And I read the document for the first time the other night. I thought it was on page 13, it turns out it's page 12, which is at the middle of that document. It's a short document. So I read the whole thing the other night, and it is a remarkably good read, I still find, and I would commend anybody in the education system who's not read it to read it, because that tells you what this whole purpose that we're trying to create in education was here. It's a very slow read, but a deep read too. All the words have a purpose and a meaning. But the thing that was best for me was the absolute clarity for the very first time that we had about what was the purpose of schooling. It's a remarkable thing to think about. We've never had it before. I touched on it in relation to the Standards of Scotland Schools Act. It's a very legal mechanism, and that was part of the way in which you create the framework in which all this happens. But we've never actually had that before. So there were clear outcomes. And that was clear for Parliament, the country. It was clear for local ministers, clear for local authorities, clear for head teachers, clear for teachers, and clear for pupils. I was telling Philip, we had a chance for a very quick chat earlier. I had a remarkable thing happen in the last year. I've got 4 grandchildren. I know they have to believe I've got 4 grandchildren, and the youngest of them went to school last year. And about 2 months after she'd gone to school, I was sitting in her home with her, and I said, "And how are you enjoying school?" And she was, it was good. I said, "What are you learning?" She said, "I'm learning to be a successful learner and a confident individual. I'm going to be an effective contributor." And she hesitated at that point, and I said, "I'm a responsible citizen." And she said, "Yes, Papa, how did you know that?" So I just think that's astonishing, that at age 5, you know exactly why you're in school. You know what the purpose is, and you can teachers and others have a conversation with you about it. She came home last week with a certificate for being a confident individual. Believe it or not, she got elected to the school, the pupil council, on the basis that she's a confident individual for standing up and making a wee speech about why she should be the representative. I'll make dissuade her from going into politics. But I just think that's astonishing, that the clarity that can give you from a very early age, you begin to think about what the whole purpose of your learning is about. And that's what that document gave. And as Philip said, the reassurance, in a sense, that I had as a minister was this was not just conceived by civil servants in the ivory towers, if I can put it that way. This had been brought about by consensus achieved in a very big group. And so I knew that I had the defenders of this document in the business community, in the parent community because they were represented, the EIS were on board, etc., 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 directors of education and so on. All the interests around the system were on board, and that's a huge asset if you're trying to sell this politically. You're off to a good start. And remember, just about every major change in Scottish education has been fought tooth and nail until you get it through. And the remarkable thing that document allowed to happen was that, and because of the process that had been gone through, was that it allowed you to build a broader consensus behind this. And that was, in a sense, my political task at that moment, was to sell this and to make sure it could sell it to colleagues in government as well as more widely. But it permitted that to happen. But it also addressed a huge number of the concerns I touched on earlier. It was the basis for making learning more flexible and relevant, particularly to that group who are becoming the casualties of the system and who are demotivated. It didn't see any relevance to the curriculum they were being taught. It was about joining up strands of learning in new and more exciting ways, and widening choice in what you learn, provided your literacy and numeracy skills were secure. The choice would open up as you went through the system. There was reference in the document to more skills for work to be done. There was a whole strand of work was developed on recognising wider achievement. Key to the document is the whole concept that learning should be enjoyable. When I first came into government, I touched on earlier, you'd have thought it was the very opposite, that learning didn't seem an awfully enjoyable thing, and desperately serious in a whole variety of ways. So anyway, it had all the sort of things in it that I was looking for. And it linked to the possibility of more personalisation of learning, whilst also, not stopping, challenging and stretching people throughout the whole system. But the key thing politically, in a sense, and in terms of managing the wider policy agenda, is that as soon as you've got clarity on the purpose of education in the way the document gave, you can afford to stand back and let the system have more space and freedom. Because you're clear what the outcomes are, why should you worry about the inputs? And previously the system had been dominated by the inputs. And so you suddenly could move away from that. So it was completely revolutionary in that sense. And that addressed some of the points I touched on earlier. It was potentially giving schools more flexibility, more freedom, head teachers more freedom, giving teachers back that space and that professional trust that we thought they needed if the system was going to perform long-term and change and adapt over time. As Philip touched on, the way I used to do this in all speeches I did to teacher events, you are the experts in education. You know this better than we know it. And we've got to trust you more, and here's the framework. We're now clear what we want as an outcome. You get on with it. I was saying to Philip earlier that I had this conversation briefly with Graham Donaldson recently, and I think he was a bit horrified, but I was kind of saying that, I don't think we should introduce any guidance at all beyond that document, because there's a danger the system keeps recomplicating itself. And part of the purpose was to get less guidance in the system. So that was all that was sort of going on. It also met concerns of parents to some extent and of employers, but more importantly in terms of the wider policy agenda, that short touch on, there was a whole pile of things going on. There was the EIFL was touched on, Determined to Succeed, the additional support for learning stuff. We were playing around with the Schools for Ambition programme. There were new school and college links being developed. The whole teacher education process was changing, etc., etc., etc. Personal learning planning, do you remember that? Another fellow came into my room one day also and said, EIS are unhappy about personal learning plans. And we've changed it to personal learning planning, and suddenly, we were, with one bound we were free. But all that stuff was happening. Now, the importance of the curriculum for excellence was that without all these other things happening, some of which are touched on, you couldn't make the curriculum for excellence work. But equally, without the curriculum for excellence, you couldn't make all the rest of it, make sense of all the rest. And suddenly, you had something sitting at the heart of the system that made a coherent whole that was sensible and could sustain itself. So without more head teacher devolved responsibility, without stronger professional inputs from teachers over time, you couldn't use the freedoms that you were going to get potentially under the new curriculum, and vice versa. So this all locked together very tightly, and that's what allowed us a much more coherence about the entire system. So from a policy-making point of view, that was the significance. The curriculum for excellence is not just about the structure of the curriculum. It is much broader than that, in the way that we were thinking about it at the time, and in that kind of way.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Just maybe before I bring Louise in, I think it might be appropriate to have another short clip from George, because I think there's a couple of things that he has to say that are quite germane to that. Get him up.
On the curriculum review group, I regret to say that we ignored assessment. I'll maybe come back to that in a little while. But because of the positive climate within which we were working, both generally and within the review group, we underestimated seriously the extent to which the teaching profession had become acculturated into a prescriptive curriculum approach, and that many teachers did not welcome with open arms the idea of greater professional autonomy, and certainly did not welcome the idea of greater professional autonomy without having greater resources on which to draw. Now, these resources might be straightforward material resources, books. They might be resources in terms of support. They might be resources in terms of time to plan. But it was clear from the engagement process which the programme board supervised that many teachers felt uncomfortable about the removal of the level of prescription within the curriculum. And the analysis that Glasgow University carried out, both of focus groups and of written responses, demonstrates that, unfortunately, very clearly. I think we also, in the curriculum review group, and then leading into the life of the programme board, underestimated the need to address issues of assessment. And I think there were 3 issues of assessment we didn't address as fully as we should have. The first was, despite all that we know about the importance accorded to school qualifications, we underestimated the washback effect of school qualifications, so that during much of the consultation in secondary schools, or much of the engagement in secondary schools, then teachers would say, well, we don't know what we're going to do in S1 to S3 until somebody tells us what the exams are going to be like, and then we can prepare for the exams in S1 to S3. And that's parodying it, but was close to reality, and that came up through several channels, including consultation conferences that were organised on the future of assessment. The second aspect that we underestimated, and indeed some of the curriculum for excellence documentation, to be honest, fudges, was that assessment for accountability, because the national tests, probably national assessments, the huge banks of S4 to S6 examinations afforded a rich database to allow people to make comparisons between schools and indeed secondary schools within schools. Now, the value of national tests, the value of national assessments is, to put it mildly, open to question. But nevertheless, they gave people who wanted to cling on to them hard statistics. And in my personal view, it's a personal view, a whole industry grew up in which people kept themselves busy, a bit like people used to school saying on a Friday afternoon, all I do to keep the kids busy, they can colour in. So we had a whole industry of colouring in beautiful charts, pinning them up on walls, looking at them, and not saying very much about what we were learning from them. And I think also we probably underestimated the readiness of teachers to draw on a range of evidence from within their classrooms for assessment in more formal ways than they were doing in their routine classroom practice. And that was a major area during the engagement process, I think, of weakness, and it certainly came up in the discussions that led up to the creation of Building the Curriculum 5, the assessment framework. We were very clear in the programme board that what we were not doing was carrying out a series of consultation exercises, that the model was one of engagement, of getting teachers to be involved in thinking about the new curriculum and contributing to developing that new curriculum. I honestly have no idea how many teachers were involved in the sense of being given time to do what, say, to develop statements of experiences and outcomes, but a considerable number were so involved, and a greater number were involved in terms of trialling materials within the school, and others were involved simply as they responded in focus groups or to questionnaires. But it would still be true to say that a large number of teachers were probably not touched by the engagement process, other than seeing a number of documents heading in their direction, which they might have felt themselves too busy to pay attention to.
Louise, is that an accurate picture, do you think?
I think that pretty much reflects the way that things were. I think that when I spoke earlier about the different innovations, the innovation cycles we've had in the past, and I think that Curriculum for Excellence started off, like all of the other innovations, with really good ideas. And that the policy process, the key ideas identified, I think there was strong support in the profession for the curriculum change. The idea of enhancing teacher professionalism was really welcomed. The idea of greater flexibility was seen to, these were all seen to respond to issues raised by teachers and schools. And the shared vision of what it meant to be an educated Scot, again, was something that was welcomed. Also, I think what was important was that it was a highly credible review group. And there were people on that group who were highly regarded across the profession. And all these things matter in creating a climate within the profession for the change process. The fact that there were representatives from across communities was a really important aspect. And the reaction to the 4 capacities was very positive. I love the story of your granddaughter. It also highlights one of the tensions that there are. And it's the fact that all too often thinking begins to go from the system. And that rather than these capacities being meaningful to people, that they simply become almost a mantra. This is the next slogan. And that if, in a sense, the purpose, I guess, of this event is to learn more about the policy process and how we enhance things. And one of the issues is how we keep people thinking and stop that slide down into kind of automatic reaction to things. And the second issue is one that I was trying to draw analogies from the past, is that in terms of the policy process, the phrase joined up policy is one that's very current, but really tricky. And the idea that you can develop a curriculum, if we take out the word assessment for a second and think and replace it with the word learning, assessment in a sense is the extent to which you gauge how much and how well people have learned. So if you're thinking about the design of a curriculum, then I think it's also incumbent on the people with that responsibility to think through what learning would look like in that context. So I think there are things to be learned from the process that as we move maybe into the next phase we'll start to tease out.
Well, moving on to the next phase for the programme board.
Yeah, just a few words about this. This is in a sense where, and I moved on fairly quickly, and as indeed did Peter, once the thing was in place, and thereby illustrating one of the perennial issues in government, which is the continuity of people dealing with these sorts of things. I think what's just been said seems to me is absolutely. I mean, I recognise that picture that George said and Louise said about how the transition, if you like, from the idea to the working through the reality of the idea in the classroom, how we manage that. And I think if I do the self-critique of that, we did not spend enough time within government thinking through that transmission mechanism. We didn't spend enough time front-end loading that process before we took it out to these big engagement exercises. I think that the spirit of that was absolutely right. It was an endeavour to engage people, to build this thing through the coming together of professionals who knew what they were doing, knew what they wanted, and able to take the principles that are encapsulated in the government in the document and get that out into the classroom to the benefit of the learners. It was a bit of a disadvantage for me in the sense that's where my lack of, if you like, previous education experience, I think, probably did bite, not having experienced that sort of cycle before. And I don't think we had enough people on sort of close to this. He said, well, hang on a minute, this is where it's gone wrong before, here's the warning signals, this is what you do to get it right. So I think if I had my time again, I think I would have encouraged ministers and the civil service to in a sense spend more time in the design process, if you like, of taking this from the concept into reality than we did. We got straight into these big engagement exercises, and that's when it began to feel a bit claggy, and where some of the tensions that we described began to kick in. And the process has taken a long time, and I think we envisaged it getting there quicker than clearly it has done. I think personally I would stand by the sort of the concepts and the principles that are embodied in the document. I think you're right, was the spirit of that was absolutely right, but clearly you have a very complex transmission mechanism from those concepts to actual teaching practice, what goes on in the classroom, the incentives for teachers, is going to embody this in their professional practice on a day-to-day basis. Again, don't test me too far on the sort of minutiae of the structures we set up, but we created the programme board with Maggie Allen to chair that, and we essentially we launched this process of exploration of how this was turned into material of guidance for the rest of it and help the teaching profession adopt it. I basically left off in mid-2006 on that journey, and clearly there's a whole lot of history since then that I wasn't, I haven't been that close to. But as I say, the learning from that for me was, and again as a sort of a policy professional, for those who are interested in this as a sort of policy exercise, the thinking about how you take the ideas from the page into working reality, that's what probably we skipped.
was saying to others that Samuel Braith was scathing about the standards of educational research in Scotland. I mean, completely scathing about it. And comparing it to his own experience in medicine, and I've not realised until very recently just how significant he was in his own field of research, in his own part of medicine. And there's something, this is the conversation about earlier, there's something about the language of academia that doesn't communicate itself to people like me in politics. And there has to, that's maybe quite a hard thing to say, but it's the case. And there's got to be a way of actually communicating that experience, which has got to be rigorous and clear and so on, in ways that can actually influence the policy process. And I have to say, my experience at that time, may have changed, was that it was not having an impact on the policy process to a significant extent. And you know, there's a kind of never let evidence get in the way of a sensible policy. Is the kind of, you know, the doctrine of very often what happens in politics, but which is completely wrong. And maybe I'm the only person in history guilty of that, just to quickly absolve others of responsibility. But there is a sense in which that, unless you're having the ideas communicated to you in a way that you can grasp and utilise, it doesn't get grasped and utilised.
Totally agree. And I think the issue is about what do we mean by a learning community, and it's a community where, you know, often we talk about innovation as if it's about getting teachers to change practices, and I think what we're talking about is something different. It's about having researchers have different practices, engage in different ways in working with communities. It's about policymakers engaging in different approaches, and it's about practitioners engaging in different approaches. So it's really a different way of being for all of us. And the only way that we can learn, I think, to communicate more effectively is by working together more closely. And it's that close collaboration and the willingness to identify and address challenging issues that actually will allow us to move our system to a position where we'll be much more comfortable with it.
You give Philip the final word in this.
Not a huge amount to add to that. As I say, I think again, the scale effect of that, there is a capacity there to bring all of those interests together, and indeed it's what we were trying to do. We've actually put in for excellence process. You know, we had people in the room who could act as a transmission mechanism from the world of academic research on education. We had the practitioners in the room, and it was about short-circuiting, if you like, all those journeys, and everybody had to travel the same journey, but bringing that wealth of experience together around a shared objective, and then finding the route out from that objective to the wider system. But these mechanisms are difficult, they're tough. It's not easy to do this stuff. You know, if we all lived our lives again, we would do these things better. There is a learning coming out of this stuff, and I hope that Bill and his team will have got that learning. So as we keep this thing rolling forward, people are embedding that in the way that we do things. And one of the things that struck me about as a policy maker, the civil servants, young civil servants coming through the system now should do their jobs better than I did. Than I've done my job in the past. That we should be able to learn from these things. So you engage better, you produce better policy, and the outcomes ultimately are better. There should be learning in the policy process as well as, if you like, in the learning system itself.
Okay, thanks very much. I think there's now an opportunity to have a kind of a short questioning period for 15 or 20 minutes or so. I think what you might have to...
I've pushed it off to 4. So.
Right. Okay. So we can open it out to the room and see if anybody wants to start with a question. Yeah.
I have a question. Why did the review group, or those who came subsequently, not develop experiences and outcomes for the senior phase? There's been a lot of talk today about the relationship between curriculum and assessment. And I think one of the lessons for me from being involved in assessment was learning around about the same time as Curriculum for Excellence was cooking, as it were, is that we tried very hard to do 2 kinds of joining the dots. One was about joining research, policy and practice together, but the other was about a relationship amongst learning, pedagogy, curriculum and assessment. And I think you cannot take those things separately. George was saying, that he felt that assessment hadn't been properly addressed. I don't think you can hide it off and do it separately from the curriculum, because if you do that, you lose a sense of progression. And if you don't have a sense of progression running right the way through, then actually it's very hard to say, as a practitioner, as a professional, what exactly does a good one look like here, which is the question that assessment asks. Now, if you don't have that sense of progression, then actually you can't do assessment properly. And one of the sadnesses for me is that now we're in a position where a document came out yesterday, at least I saw it for the first time yesterday, looking at a review led by Ken in the GTCS of the implementation of the first year of the national qualifications. The word progression is not mentioned once in that document. Why not? How can we do assessment properly if we don't have an idea of where the progression is going? And to my mind, that was one of the big wrong turnings of the whole of the implementation of curriculum for excellence. We didn't ever have a clear notion of what progression through till the senior phase really looked like. We left it to the exams to define what that meant. And I think that was one of the reasons why, to my mind, we're not really where we should be with the implementation. So that's my question. Why not?
I was very glad I couldn't possibly sort of give you a very detailed answer on that, so we're going back to policy discussion quite a long time ago. I think I recognise the issue you're describing, and I think there was, as I said earlier on, is the segue from the curriculum review group itself to the next stage of the process. We didn't think through that join well enough. I mean, I'm slightly busking now, but something that we maybe should have done is to keep the curriculum review group running. Once it had produced this product, would have then been still in place to take the learning and thinking from that and then apply it to the bits of the system that needed to be adapted in a way that would then deliver the product in a more seamless fashion. And I think we allowed that break to happen, and in a way then the spirit was slightly dissipated and it began to go off in slightly different directions. So, again, that's the learning I'd take from it. It's quite a long time ago now, clearly. But it was the follow through. Somebody once said to me when I was moving jobs quite quickly, said one day, a young man, which was quite a while ago, he said, "You'll do a job long enough to deal with the consequences of your own mistakes." And it comes back to this point that Peter and I were making earlier on about the disjunction you get in the system. And I think there was a point of disjunction there which didn't help us, to be honest about it. And it was therefore creating more distance in the system towards implementation than may be necessary. But that would be my observation, say, from some distance now in time.
I can't answer your question technically. I'm kind of a step back from that. That's professional's job to deal with all that kind of stuff. But I wrote some stuff after I left office. I wrote some stuff about all of this. Somebody suggested I should, and so I captured some of it. And I was reading some of it the other evening in preparation for this. And I had become convinced, even in the first time I was in education, and then more so when I came back. I mentioned my kind of worry about the dominance of the exam system. And what I discovered from rereading what I'd written was a passage about it talking about how I'd come to the conclusion that standard we ought to go completely. Personal conclusion. I don't know why we examine kids at that age across the entirety of the systems, pretty much beyond me, frankly. But I knew I couldn't persuade my colleagues of that at that time, and therefore did I invest any time in that? No. I actually, in the stuff I was reading, describe how you had to deal with the curriculum and think about that first, and then work out the assessment processes that follow. And the great tragedy for me at the heart, and this is what's happened in recent times too, I guess, is that the exam system still drives the system. And it comes back to this point about being able to criticise our own system. We've never really had a serious debate, in my view, about that big question about how much time and resource do we devote into that 16 exam structure, age 16 exam structure, and is it the right thing to do? We've touched on it a lot of time, but we've never really got into it. And that's something that we probably need to do, and then you can perhaps make more sense of some of the issues that you're talking about. I mean, I'm just enormously struck about how we appear to still teach what we're about to examine, rather than examine what we think is right to teach. And we've got it thoroughly round. And that's partly because there's so much time and effort and structure invested in our exam system. And if you go out there and try and sell to the community, the population at large, we should actually do away with some exams, I can tell you what reaction you're going to get. You're a bloody hard sell. But that debate at that level in school, and actually further testing that really still exists in school, and the whole business of the summative assessment and formative assessment and all that kind of stuff, we've never really, in my view, had a serious enough debate about that, and yet it's right at the heart of our system. It's a very powerful driver of all that happens.
Okay, can we take a couple of questions? One over here.
A cautionary note about the constant appeal to the word consensus. First of all, it is no accident that the word begins with a con, and a great deal of consensus in Scottish educational policy making is carefully managed. It's managed consensus, in which dissident voices are systematically excluded. However, my question is this. It's to do with the relative power and influence of the different players in the policy process. Politicians, professionals, career civil servants, and a group that we haven't really heard enough about, inspectors, who are also career civil servants, of course. And one of the things that interests me is the extent of the influence of civil servants. Two quick examples which suggest that they were actually strongly influential at key points in Curriculum for Excellence. The first is the decision to change the name from Our Curriculum for Excellence to Curriculum for Excellence. The dropping of the word A may seem insignificant, but if you have Our Curriculum for Excellence, it allows the possibility that there is another or other curricula for excellence. It is very much in the Scottish tradition to assume that there is one right answer, so we had Curriculum for Excellence. The second point is to do with the emergence of the word capacities, the 4 capacities. And I'm afraid I wasn't reassured by Peter's story of his granddaughter's acceptance of these 4 terms. That struck me as positively Orwellian, that a child at that early stage should be repeating the mantra that had dominated policy discourse in Scottish education. And 2 years ago, I was asked by somebody outside Scotland, indeed outside the UK, where did this word capacity come from? And I didn't immediately know the answer. So I emailed 2 of the members of the original review group, whom I happened to be on quite good terms with, and said, where did this word capacity come from? And I got more or less identical replies from the 2 of them. They said, we didn't suggest it, we didn't produce it, we didn't like it at all. The word appeared at a very late stage in the documentation. It was a document drafted by a civil servant. So, is the story we are constantly told that civil servants don't make policy, and they merely implement policies approved by political level? Is that a deception, an illusion, a convenient fiction?
Okay, Alan?
Thanks. The first thing I would want to say is that I wish this event had taken place before I wrote up my doctoral thesis, which is on precisely this story. But I suppose I'm reassured that I've not heard anything today, hopefully, that contradicts any of my findings. But I would want to pick up on some of the stuff that emerged when I spoke to a broad range of 12 people who were engaged in this process at various points. And it was partly to do with that post-devolutionary context that I think Peter spoke about, this notion that there was a commitment to engagement, a commitment to consult, and that in Peter's comments that there was a very clear sense of the post-devolution settlement involves very systematic approaches to legislation. That these are all very clearly laid out. The pre-legislative scrutiny phase follows on to the committee stage, and we have that kind of parliamentary and executive journey towards legislation. However, curriculum for excellence falls within the policy domain, and to my mind that remains very opaque. We don't have anything like the same clarity about process embedded in the Scottish system. So we still have confusion around the different roles, the different nodes of power in the system, who actually controls this process, what is the role of the civil service. And I think much of the, many of the issues that have emerged over the years has been about that lack of clarity, because when it isn't clear in the process, then it can be captured. And I think that's what we've seen over the years, that HMI have intervened. Walter's picked up some of the civil service interventions, but equally there were critical interventions from the inspector around the formulation of the 8 subject areas, their involvement in the creation of the writing groups for the experiences and outcomes. So there was all of that kind of stuff going on, and perhaps we just lacked the clarity in the policy process as opposed to the legislative process.
Okay. Questions about civil service role?
So I remember having this conversation with Walter about 10 years ago, thinking about the role of the civil service, and there was a rather poor joke about mandarins being a bit sort of sour or something. So this is an eternal debate, isn't it, about the role of civil service in these processes, but then if you add into the mix the sort of, in particular in the educational context, the role of the experts and HMI and so on, and that was a big part of the debate at the time, the influence of all of these different players in it, and can you make this system wholly transparent, the relationship between the different actors in it. I mean, in a sense, in an ideal world, of course, these processes are transparent. I have to say, I think if you look at the Scottish system, if you like, in comparison, not just the rest of the UK, but further afield across the world, I think you find the Scottish system looks and feels very transparent in the way the policy is made across 101 different areas. So, there is always a comparative thing one needs to do around all this stuff. But clearly, you can always evolve and develop it. And my own view is that the quality of policy making in the world we live in now is one which is out there. It is about connectivity, it's about understanding systems, it is about making connections, it is visible, it's not about people sitting in their rooms in whatever building they're in, thinking about policy. That does not make good policy in the world that we live in these days. So in terms of the spirit of what you described, I'm absolutely with you on that. Is the world a perfect place? No, it isn't. And of course we've got a way to go on that in pretty much whichever policy that you're operating in. As to the relationship between ministers and civil servants, there is a sort of calendar there that somehow civil servants are the ones who direct. The Minister Peter can speak for himself. I thought, without sort of getting into too much fun, I thought we built a very good relationship in this context between the political side and the official side. I've always seen my job as a civil servant to, as I said earlier on, it is about working out what ministers want and how that then is delivered. That's the job. There is no other job, pleasing the title of civil servants. And I think in this context, when you're working with, you get a good working relationship between the minister and the team, you can do great things. If that relationship breaks down, actually, it actually makes it harder, if you like, for the civil servants to bring their professionalism to bear in a way that helps to deliver good policy. And one of the reasons that this was, I think, a very productive time in policy making education in Scotland was we had a good relationship across that team.
No, I would echo that entirely. And it was one of the more productive, I thought, periods too, that there was a good team feeling about the whole thing. And it comes to Walter's point about and capacities. It sounded like a conspiracy, there's a purposeful conspiracy. I don't subscribe to conspiracy theories generally. They're quite difficult to organise, I think. And so I would generally subscribe to the pop-up theory of life. And I wouldn't leave, there's every possibility that this was simply, a debate in the office, is it capacity or is it something else? And there's somebody pumped for it, it's conspiratorial and anything. So, and it may have implications, but I don't think it's conspiratorial. And I think that the point about the way the civil service can operate, it partly depends upon the politician involved too, the extent to which you give it latitude to operate and merit in that. It's also, the thing I found in ministerial office was the absolute need to be clear, precisely clear about what you want. And if you're clear about what you want, you'll get what you want, because the system will deliver. Now, is every politician completely clear about what they want? No. But they might have a sense of direction. And the civil service are hugely skilled, it's a point for me, about helping you become precisely clear about what you want. And there's all sorts of influence in that, clearly. Civil servants are hugely influential, but ministers are ultimately decisive on this. And you know, in that process we went through, it was, I mean, my personal style of working tends to be collaborative rather than any other kind of style. That's the right way of describing it. So I get more out of that, I learn more, and we can come to a consensus amongst ourselves about what might be the right way forward, or if we can't, the minister will ultimately determine that. But civil servants are clearly influential in that, but you know, I wouldn't overstate the influence in this context in that way. And kind of a wider point too, about, you know, where does power and influence actually lie, that again I come back to this kind of point that Alan's made, the post-evolutionary settlement. I mean, you could live, you know, there are politicians who would behave like Michael Gove. I mean, to be honest with you, I think the system in England is so difficult to get your arms round. You sometimes just got to behave that way to drive any prospect of any change whatsoever. You just wouldn't get away with that in Scotland. It's not the art of the possible. I think you would be very quickly tripped up in a whole variety of ways. And it's just not, I don't think that cuts any longer with the style in which politics is played. And that's got a downside as well as an upside, but I just don't think that would cut.
Okay, we've got two final questioners. One over here. Yeah.
It's just a comment on what George McBride said, then teachers uncomfortable with the removal of curriculum prescription, and to some extent I think to assessment prescription, and that's very much what we've tried to do. And I suppose I'm thinking about, Louise came and we had a discussion about policy and some of the difficulties of the initial years of implementation. I suppose it's about holding our nerve, you know, during this kind of implementation phase, and staying true to the curriculum assessment and qualification system that we have built here, and not getting driven, of course, by pragmatic kind of, okay, we'll give you some assessments, or we'll give you some more prescription for you know, to keep people happy and quiet. But then we're removing very professional autonomy that we've been trying to give back to the profession by doing. So it's not really a question, it's more of a comment.
I'm not sure mine's a question, it's more a comment as well. And I think listening to everybody today in terms of what is our understanding of the system and how we can make it work better in terms of bringing things together, because if you think of the individual pieces that we heard about today, you mentioned the review of teacher education that came during your time in office, and we think in there about universities, schools and local authorities working together. We think of the innovation around future learning and teaching. We think of the Schools for Ambition in terms of mentors from universities working with the schools around ideas that the schools themselves have come up with. And that kind of model of professional learning that was so rich and so deep, all of the model that was in place around the assessment is for learning in terms of how we were working with ideas out in schools, and the kind of trialling of curriculum for excellence when it was at a draft stage. And all of these, if you look at them in themselves, were great things that were going on in the system, and yet what we haven't got is that understanding of actually how these could work together, how we could get a sense of a cumulative effect, how you could actually get progression from one initiative together from another, and how they join together. We need to ask the critical questions about why didn't these things join up? You know, what were the blockers? What were the things that we needed to do better? You know, we've identified them today. I think the next step is now learning and asking the critical questions of why we didn't learn, and why they didn't come together, and why we didn't build from one another.
Can I just make a comment on that too? I think one of the things that I think is remarkable with Scotland, in a negative sense actually, is that there isn't space for exactly this kind of dialogue in the normal calendar of life. And I can tell you there is no risk-free space for a minister in Scotland. Every space carries a risk, and at a senior level in the civil service, you've got to be extremely cautious about where you can float certain ideas or not. and there is a need for space to allow people to talk about these things in a risk-free way, and we don't really have that. I mean, if Des' efforts here and more widely can help with that, I would applaud that.
I think that is a key tension, because the sense of the political imperative to deliver, because of the noise in the system, if that isn't done, pushes things to happen when actually they might not be. It would have been better if it happened either not in that time scale or not in that way. But the challenge is that tension of the political imperative to deliver.
If I could just make a kind of related comment in trying to draw this to a close. I mean, I think that a lot of people in academia think that the role of evidence is to be instrumental to actually effect policy change by persuading people of a particular point of view, getting your evidence across and thereby effecting change. I see it entirely differently. I think evidence is about creating space for politicians to explore different kinds of options and possibilities. And one of the things we really need to do in the university sector is begin to think about how the way in which we produce evidence can actually allow politicians a bit more space than they would otherwise have to take different decisions or to pursue different paths in a way that's relatively safe. And I think if we move in that direction, we would be doing something.